For nearly 3 decades, the Illinois River has been ground zero for one of the most alarming invasive species disasters in American history. A slow-motion takeover so severe that, in some stretches of water, these fish came to account for as much as 70% of the entire living weight of everything swimming beneath the surface. Boats couldn't safely pass through certain stretches without fish the size of large dogs launching themselves into the air and slamming into windshields, engines, and startled passengers. Native species that had lived in these waters for thousands of years were being pushed toward collapse. And for years, it looked like nothing could stop them. Not electric barriers, not underwater sound cannons, not millions of dollars in federal research funding. But something has shifted. In stretch after stretch of the Illinois River, catch numbers that once climbed relentlessly year over year have started bending downward, and in some of the most heavily monitored pools, biologists are documenting population crashes nobody predicted even 5 years ago. The obvious assumption is that some new government barrier or high-tech deterrent finally cracked the problem. It didn't. The actual force driving this fish into retreat turns out to be something far stranger, far more human, and honestly, a lot more interesting than anything engineers built. By the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly what's been happening beneath the surface of this river, and why the thing actually beating back one of the worst invasive species crises in American history isn't a machine at all. Here's what we're going to walk through together. We're going to go back to how these fish ended up in American rivers in the first place, because the origin story is honestly stranger than most people realize. We're going to explain exactly how badly they took over the Illinois River ecosystem and why they became such an unstoppable force once they got established. We're going to get into the actual numbers behind this recent decline, because the scale of what's being pulled out of this river is almost impossible to picture. We're going to reveal exactly who or what this unexpected predator actually is, and how an entire state government ended up staking millions of dollars on convincing Americans to eat an invasive fish. And then we're going to talk about the massive billion-dollar engineering project racing against the clock just north of here, because if this fish makes it past one particular choke point near Chicago, everything we're discussing today changes completely. Let's start with how these fish got here, because it genuinely was not an accident born out of ignorance. It was a deliberate government-backed solution to a real problem that ended up spiraling completely out of control. Back in the early 1960s and through the 1970s, bighead carp, silver carp, grass carp, and black carp were imported from China and other parts of Asia for a purpose that sounds almost noble on paper. Wastewater treatment facilities and aquaculture farms across the American South were struggling with excess algae and vegetation clogging their ponds. And these carp species are extraordinarily efficient filter feeders, capable of stripping enormous volumes of plankton and plant matter out of the water in a single day. Officials figured that instead of using chemical treatments that might eventually leach into the broader food chain, they could simply stock these ponds with fish that would eat the problem away naturally. For a while, in the controlled environment of a fish farm or a sewage lagoon, that worked exactly as intended. But controlled environments have a way of not staying controlled. Major flooding events throughout the 1970s and 1980s repeatedly overwhelmed containment ponds across Arkansas and neighboring states, and carp escaped by the thousands directly into connected waterways, feeding into the Mississippi River system. From there, nature did what it does best. These fish began working their way upstream, spreading through the Mississippi's massive watershed, which touches parts of 31 states, and by the 1990s, they had found their way into the Illinois River, a tributary that turned out to offer nearly perfect conditions for an unchecked population explosion. And explode is genuinely the right word for what happened next. Bighead and silver carp in particular are almost perfectly designed to dominate a river ecosystem once they arrive. A single mature female can release anywhere from several 100,000 to well over 1 million eggs during a single spawning event. And these fish reach sexual maturity astonishingly fast compared to most native North American species. They grow enormous, regularly reaching 4 feet in length and over 100 pounds. And because they feed by filtering plankton directly out of the water column, rather than hunting individual prey, they're essentially vacuuming up the base of the entire aquatic food web before native fish even get a chance to eat. Think about what that actually means for an ecosystem. Nearly every native fish species, from the smallest minnows to prized sport fish like bluegill, crappie, and yellow perch, depends on plankton as a critical food source at some stage of its life, especially as juveniles. When an invasive species shows up that can strip that food source out of the water faster and more efficiently than anything already living there, it doesn't just compete with native fish for resources, it starves them out from the bottom of the food chain up. A peer-reviewed study analyzing nearly 20 years of population data on the upper Mississippi River system found a clear, statistically solid link between rising Asian carp numbers and significant declines in exactly those prized native species, giving biologists some of the first hard evidence connecting the carp invasion directly to measurable ecological damage, rather than just anecdotal concern. The researcher who led that study, a fisheries biologist directing a University of Illinois field station, described it at the time as adding further weight to an argument that had been building for years, warning explicitly that the population trends showing up in the data were not the kind of trends anyone wanted to see spreading into other river systems across the country. By the mid-2000s, the situation on the Illinois River had become something close to a full ecological takeover. Silver carp specifically developed a bizarre and genuinely dangerous behavioral quirk. They leap violently out of the water when startled by the vibration of an approaching boat motor, sometimes clearing several feet of air and colliding directly with anything or anyone in the boat's path. Videos of boaters getting pelted by dozens of airborne slime-covered fish at once became a strange, viral corner of the internet. But for people who actually made their living on this river, commercial fishermen, recreational anglers, tour operators, it was a genuine occupational hazard, resulting in real injuries, cracked windshields, and no small number of ruined fishing trips. One biologist working at a field station along the river described suddenly having to throttle down a research boat after a barrage of silver carp came flying out of the water and pummeled everyone on board, leaving behind a generous, unmistakable layer of fish slime across every surface. Stories like that aren't isolated exaggerations. They've become such a routine part of life on certain stretches of the river that longtime residents barely react anymore when it happens. By some estimates, during the peak of the invasion, Asian carp made up as much as 70% of the total biomass in significant stretches of the Illinois River, an almost unfathomable dominance for a single group of invasive species in a river system that historically supported dozens of native fish species living in relative balance. If you're finding value in a deep dive like this one, go ahead and hit that like button right now and drop a comment letting me know if you've ever actually seen these fish jumping on a river near you, because I guarantee some of you have stories. And if you want to keep up with how this story develops, particularly with the massive engineering project we're going to get into later in this video, go ahead and subscribe now so you don't miss the update when it comes. All right, let's keep going. Because the response to this crisis is where things get genuinely surprising. For years, the primary line of defense against these fish spreading further north toward the Great Lakes was a series of electric barriers built into the Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal, essentially underwater fences that use electrical current running through the water to discourage fish from swimming through a specific stretch of channel. The first demonstration barrier was completed near Romeoville, Illinois back in 2002, and a stronger, more permanent version followed a few years later. These barriers have genuinely helped slow the fish's northward crawl, but they were never actually designed to reduce the population already established downstream in the Illinois River itself. They were a defensive wall, not an offensive weapon. And walls, no matter how sophisticated, don't solve a problem that's already established and breeding explosively behind them. For roughly a decade, the carp population downstream of that barrier just kept climbing, and officials increasingly understood that stopping the spread northward wasn't the same thing as actually reducing the overwhelming numbers already dominating the river. So here's where the story takes its genuinely unexpected turn, the one hinted at in the very title of this video. The single most effective force that has actually begun pushing this invasive species into retreat isn't a barrier, isn't a poison, isn't a high-tech acoustic deterrent. It's human appetite. Back in 2010, Illinois wildlife officials made a decision that sounds almost desperate on paper, but turned out to be strategically brilliant. If you can't beat them, eat them. The state began contracting directly with commercial fishing operations, paying them to intensively harvest carp out of specific, carefully targeted stretches of the Illinois River, essentially turning professional fishermen into a coordinated government-funded predator force operating at a scale no natural predator in this ecosystem could ever match. In the area where this program first launched, along the upper Illinois River closest to the electric barrier system protecting Lake Michigan, carp stocks have genuinely plummeted since the effort began. Removal totals in that specific stretch alone climbed past 17 million pounds between 2010 and 2025, and officials have documented reductions in fish density in those upstream pools approaching an almost unbelievable 95% over the past 13 years. Now, here's the obstacle that program ran into almost immediately, and it's actually a fascinating problem in its own right. You can pay commercial fishermen to pull carp out of a river by the ton, but that only works long term if there's somewhere for all that fish to actually go, and for years, there simply wasn't. Asian carp had earned a genuinely terrible reputation in the American market, seen as a bottom-feeding trash fish nobody wanted on their dinner plate, despite the fact that these particular species are actually top and mid-water filter feeders. not bottom feeders at all, and are widely and happily eaten throughout Asia, where they're considered a perfectly normal, tasty part of the diet. Illinois officials realized that if they wanted commercial fishing to become a sustainable, scalable weapon against this invasion, they needed to solve a marketing problem, not just a fishing problem. That's exactly why, in 2022, the state of Illinois did something that honestly sounds almost comedic if you didn't understand the strategy behind it. They rebranded the fish entirely, giving it a brand new name. Copy, short for copious, meant to reflect just how abundant these fish had become in Illinois waters. Illinois Department of Natural Resources. Director Colleen Callahan explained the thinking behind the name at the time, noting it was short, crisp, and easy to say, exactly the kind of thing that could intrigue a diner reading it off a restaurant menu for the first time. This wasn't the first time an unpopular fish got a friendlier name to boost its market appeal. Patagonian toothfish became the far more appetizing-sounding Chilean sea bass. An ugly deep-sea fish called slimehead was reintroduced to the world as orange roughy and became a restaurant staple. Illinois officials were betting that the same trick could work here, transforming a fish nobody wanted to eat into a genuine culinary product people would actively seek out. And it's actually worked better than almost anyone expected. Chefs in Chicago began putting copy into po' boys, crab cakes, croquettes, and tacos, describing the flavor as clean, savory, and firmer than cod, with none of the strong fishy taste people associated with the old Asian carp name. One chef, using the fish regularly in his kitchen, described it as extremely versatile, noting that because the flavor of the fish itself doesn't overpower a dish, cooks are free to season and pair it however they like, treating it more like a blank canvas than a strongly flavored specialty catch. Not everyone in the industry embraced the rebrand, though. At least one major processor shipping millions of pounds of the fish overseas each year has stuck with the original Asian carp label, arguing that international buyers already know and trust that name, and that switching it for an unfamiliar American marketing term risked confusing an export market that was already working just fine. State officials estimate that somewhere between 20 and 50 million pounds of copy could realistically be harvested from the Illinois River alone every single year if demand kept climbing. And every pound pulled out for human consumption, pet treats, fish meal, or fertilizer, represents one less fish left in the water competing with native species, and one less fish capable of reproducing and adding to the next generation. The overall numbers behind this combined effort are genuinely staggering when you step back and look at them together. Between the Upper River Removal Program and a second, even larger effort covering roughly 240 miles of the Lower Illinois River through the Alton, LaGrange, and Peoria pools, the state crossed a milestone in 2025 that took 15 years to reach. Nearly 50 million pounds of invasive carp physically removed from this single river system. To put that number in some kind of perspective, that's roughly equivalent in total weight to about 5,000 adult elephants pulled out of one Midwestern river. In 2025 alone, more than 7 million pounds came out through these two combined programs, and one particularly aggressive 10-day harvest operation in the Starved Rock Pool a few years earlier pulled out 750,000 pounds of silver carp in barely a week and a half, described by state fisheries managers as likely a record for freshwater harvest anywhere in the United States. These aren't hobbyist anglers with rod and reel. These are professional commercial crews working under direct contract with state biologists, using specialized nets and boat-based electrofishing techniques specifically designed to locate and corral massive schools of carp before hauling them out by the ton. What makes this whole strategy so genuinely clever from an ecological standpoint is that it essentially recreates, at industrial scale, exactly the kind of predation pressure this invasive species never had to deal with back in its native range. In the rivers of China and East Asia, where these carp species evolved, they coexist with a whole suite of natural predators, and, just as importantly, an enormous existing human fishing tradition that has targeted and consumed these exact species for centuries, keeping populations in a rough natural balance. When these fish arrived in the Mississippi and Illinois river systems, they found no native predator large enough, numerous enough, or specialized enough to meaningfully check their numbers, and for decades, they found no meaningful human market for their meat either. They had, in effect, escaped both halves of the pressure that kept them in check back home. The state's harvest and rebranding strategy essentially rebuilt half of that missing equation from scratch, engineering a human-predator relationship into an ecosystem that had never developed one naturally. It's not a subtle intervention, and it's not a particularly glamorous one, but the population data coming out of the most intensively fished stretches of the Illinois River suggests it's working better than almost any other tool tried so far. There's a genuinely interesting economic footnote to this story, too. One that connects the carp boom to a much older, quietly struggling industry. Commercial fishing itself has been in a long decline across Illinois for the better part of a century, with the number of licensed commercial fishermen in the state dropping by more than half over the last 4 decades, from roughly 229 full-time operators back in 1950 down to only about 30 by 2020. Fewer people are choosing this as a career. Boats have gotten bigger and more efficient to compensate, and the whole industry increasingly looks less like the small, family-run river fisheries of previous generations, and more like a leaner, higher-volume operation built around covering more water with fewer crews. And yet, even as the number of fishermen has shrunk dramatically, total pounds of fish harvested from Illinois waters hasn't declined the way you might expect, largely because Asian carp harvest has surged in to fill the gap. By 2007, these invasive fish had already become the single most harvested species in Illinois rivers, and that trend has only deepened since the copy rebrand created fresh demand. In a strange way, an invasive species crisis ended up throwing a lifeline to a struggling traditional industry, giving remaining commercial fishing operations a reliable, abundant, state-subsidized catch to build a modern business around, right at the moment when that industry might otherwise have kept fading into irrelevance. It's worth being honest, though, about where the limits of this success actually sit, because overstating a win here would do a disservice to the complexity of what's actually happening. Researchers monitoring the broader food web have found that invasive carp densities have dropped enough in the uppermost pools of the Illinois River to meaningfully reduce their impact on key plankton populations, the base of the food chain these fish were devouring. But that same encouraging response has not yet been clearly documented further downstream, where carp remain in much higher numbers across a much longer stretch of river, and solid evidence that native fish populations are actually rebounding as a direct result of the removal effort is still limited and remains an active area of ongoing study. Think of it a bit like trying to bail water out of a boat that's still taking on water through a hole you haven't fully patched yet. Bailing hard and consistently in one section can absolutely keep that part of the boat dry, and that's exactly what's happening in the upper river near the electric barrier, where 13 years of sustained, targeted effort has produced a genuinely dramatic, well-documented result. But bail a little less consistently somewhere else, or stop bailing entirely for even a season, and the water level in that section climbs right back to where it started. That's the honest picture of the lower 240 miles of river right now. The harvest numbers there are enormous and genuinely encouraging on their own terms, but the sheer scale of that stretch, combined with carp densities that were higher to begin with, means the same kind of dramatic population collapse seen upstream hasn't shown up yet and might take considerably longer to materialize even under the best conditions. Scientists reviewing decades of similar invasive species suppression efforts across different ecosystems found that aggressive removal programs like this one produced a clear, measurable recovery in native species roughly half the time, meaning the outcome isn't guaranteed just because you're successfully pulling millions of pounds of the invader out of the water. And there's a deeper, more stubborn biological reality working against permanent victory here too. These fish are broadcast spawners capable of producing staggering numbers of eggs whenever water levels rise, which means even a population that's been aggressively suppressed for years can rebound with startling speed the moment sustained harvest pressure lets up. This isn't a fight that gets won once and then forgotten. It's a fight that has to be actively maintained year after year, indefinitely, or the gains made over the past decade and a half could genuinely erode. Now let's talk about the much bigger, much more consequential battle still unfolding just north of all this, because everything we've discussed so far has been about managing carp that are already established in the Illinois River. The far more urgent question hanging over this entire situation is whether they can be stopped from ever reaching the Great Lakes at all, a body of water that supplies drinking water to more than 40 million people and supports tens of billions of dollars in commercial fishing and tourism activity every single year. The current electric barrier system near Romoville has done real work slowing the northward advance, but it was never designed as a permanent, foolproof solution, and disturbingly, fishermen and researchers have documented individual Asian carp turning up on the wrong side of that barrier on at least a handful of occasions since 2009, evidence that the current defenses aren't entirely impenetrable. Environmental DNA monitoring, a technique that detects trace genetic material fish leave behind in the water, even when no actual fish has been physically caught or seen, has occasionally turned up positive carp signals, even beyond the barrier system, adding another layer of uncertainty to exactly how secure that line of defense really is. As biologists studying the species have pointed out, for any invasive fish population, if you manage to catch even one individual that slipped past your defenses, there are almost certainly more that went undetected, since detection methods are never perfect. That's exactly why the Army Corps of Engineers, working alongside the states of Illinois and Michigan, has spent years developing what's known as the Brandon Road Interbasin Project, an elaborate, roughly $15 billion engineering barrier being constructed at a narrow choke point on the Des Plaines River near Joliet, Illinois. The design layers together multiple deterrent technologies at once, rather than relying on any single method: an electric barrier similar in concept to the existing one, underwater acoustic deterrents that blast sound frequencies fish find intolerable, a wall of rising air bubbles designed to disorient and discourage fish from swimming through, and an engineered flushing lock capable of clearing out any fish that manage to get trapped in the lock chamber during normal river traffic. It's essentially a defense-in-depth strategy, betting that even if one layer of deterrent fails to stop a determined fish, the next layer will. But this project has become almost as much a story about political turbulence as it is about engineering. And the most recent chapter of that story is happening right now, essentially in real time as this video comes together. After years of negotiation and planning, construction on the first phase of Brandon Road finally began in earnest, with contractors completing initial site work and rock removal through 2025. An early milestone project managers described as clearing the way for the more complex engineered channel construction still to come, including the flushing lock, the electrical deterrent system, and a dedicated support facilities building expected to take shape over the following few years. Then, in late July of this year, contractors on site received a formal stop work order, halting construction entirely and placing the project under an unexplained administrative review, despite roughly $2 million in materials already delivered to the job site and shaft drilling work scheduled to begin within weeks. This actually marks the second significant disruption to the project's timeline in less than a year, following an earlier funding freeze that stalled progress between December 2025 and April 2026, a pause that was only resolved after direct political intervention, including a White House meeting involving Michigan's governor, ultimately securing presidential support for the project to move forward again. Illinois officials have publicly pushed back hard against this latest stoppage, pointing out that the Great Lakes provide drinking water to tens of millions of people and support an economy worth tens of billions of dollars annually, arguing there's simply too much at stake to let a project this critical stall out over unexplained bureaucratic delays. Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker put the frustration bluntly, saying that under his administration, Illinois had spearheaded this project to protect the entire Great Lakes region, only to see repeated roadblocks thrown up with no clear explanation for the latest full stoppage. As of right now, the length of this newest administrative review remains genuinely unclear, leaving one of the most important pieces of infrastructure standing between this invasive species and the Great Lakes sitting frozen in an unfinished state. It's a strange kind of limbo for a project everyone directly involved, state officials, federal engineers, environmental advocacy groups, and even the navigation industry that regularly meets with project managers to coordinate around construction schedules, generally agrees is necessary. The disagreement isn't really about whether Brandon Road should exist. It's about funding priorities, administrative process, and the kind of bureaucratic friction that can stall even a broadly popular infrastructure project for months at a time, all while the clock keeps running on a species that reproduces by the hundreds of thousands every single spawning season. Think about the strange symmetry sitting at the heart of this entire story. On one stretch of river, the most effective weapon against this invasive species turned out to be something remarkably low-tech and human, convincing enough people to develop an appetite for an unwanted fish that professional fishermen could be paid to hunt it at an industrial scale, effectively rebuilding a predator relationship that evolution never got the chance to create naturally in North American waters. And just a short distance north, the most sophisticated, expensive, high-technology defense ever built specifically to stop this same species sits partially finished. Its completion date now hostage to funding disputes and administrative reviews rather than engineering challenges. The fish itself hasn't gotten any less dangerous or any less capable of devastating an ecosystem it invades. What's changed is that humans finally found two very different tools capable of actually pushing back. One built on appetite and commerce, working in the water it already occupies, and one built on concrete, steel, and electricity, standing guard at the one narrow gateway that still separates it from an entire ocean-sized freshwater ecosystem it hasn't yet destroyed. There's also a broader lesson buried in this story that extends well beyond fish and well beyond Illinois. Invasive species management around the world has traditionally leaned almost entirely on either extermination technology, poisons, barriers, trapping, or on prevention, trying to stop a species from ever establishing a foothold in the first place. What Illinois stumbled into with the copy rebrand and commercial harvest program represents a genuinely different category of solution, one that doesn't try to fight economics, it tries to harness it. Instead of treating an invasive species purely as an ecological problem requiring an ecological solution, officials essentially asked a market question. What would it take to make people want to remove this species voluntarily, at scale, indefinitely, without needing constant government subsidy to sustain the effort? It's not a perfect answer. Removal in the lower river still relies heavily on state harvest incentive payments rather than pure self-sustaining market demand, and biologists are honest that the long-term ecological payoff is still being studied rather than fully proven. But as a case study in creative problem solving against an invasive species that had, by nearly every measure, already won its takeover of a major American river system, it's hard to find a more genuinely surprising success story anywhere in modern wildlife management. So here's where all of this leaves the Illinois River right now, in the middle of 2026. Carp numbers in the most intensively harvested upstream stretches have fallen dramatically, likely the most significant sustained decline this invasive population has experienced anywhere in its entire American range. Commercial fishing crews, backed by state contracts and a genuinely successful rebranding campaign, continue pulling millions of pounds of copy out of the water every single year, feeding a growing market for fish meal, pet treats, fertilizer, and increasingly human dinner plates. And yet the single most important piece of the entire defense strategy, the barrier meant to permanently seal off the Great Lakes from this fish for good, remains unfinished, its timeline now dictated as much by political and administrative decisions in Washington as by anything happening on the riverbank itself. The carp haven't been defeated. They've been pushed back meaningfully and measurably by an approach nobody would have predicted a decade and a half ago, but the fight to keep them contained and to keep them from ever reaching the Great Lakes is still very much ongoing, and its outcome is still genuinely uncertain. So here's the question I'd genuinely like to hear your thoughts on in the comments below. Do you think market-based solutions like the copy rebrand, essentially turning an ecological disaster into a food product, could realistically work as a model for tackling other invasive species problems around the country? Or is the Illinois river carp situation a fairly unique case that isn't easily repeated elsewhere? Let me know what you think down in the comments, and if you want to stay updated on how the Brandon Road Project situation develops, along with the latest population numbers coming out of this river, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next update. It's the kind of story that could genuinely shift in either direction within the next few months, depending on decisions being made in offices far from the riverbank itself. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.